The waves rolled gently against the shore, their steady rhythm blending with the rustling of palm trees in the warm breeze. Amelia Island, a pristine coastal retreat in Florida, was known for its luxurious villas and serene beaches. For newlyweds, Saraphina Harper and Declan Whitmore, it promised to be the perfect destination for their honeymoon, a week of peace and privacy following their grand wedding celebration. Their villa, Azure Cove, was tucked away on the quieter side of the island, offering seclusion and breathtaking views of the ocean. The expansive deck led to a private path winding down to the sand, where the couple could enjoy long walks without interruption. Everything seemed idyllic, but beneath the surface of perfection, small fractures began to show. On their third night at the villa, the couple had been seen walking along the beach. Saraphina wore a bright orange sundress that fluttered in the evening breeze. A neighbor, Beatrice Moore, had noticed them from her balcony, smiling as Saraphina waved politely. Yet something about their interaction lingered in Beatrice's mind. Declan's movements seemed tense, his posture rigid, and though Saraphina's smile was warm, there was an unmistakable stiffness in the way he held her hand. The following morning, the island's tranquility was shattered when a 911 call was made from the villa. Declan reported Saraphina missing, explaining that she had gone for a morning jog along the beach and hadn't returned. Officers from the Amelia Island Sheriff's Department arrived promptly. Detective Caleb Morris, a seasoned investigator, led the team. At first glance, the villa looked untouched, as though its occupants had simply stepped out to enjoy the day. Inside, the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. A glass of wine sat half empty on the coffee table, and faint traces of sand near the deck's entrance hinted at recent activity. It was clean, too clean for a couple spending days on the beach. Declan, dressed in casual resort wear, appeared composed as he recounted his version of events. His calm demeanor stood in a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. As he spoke, Detective Morris took in the details, his experienced eyes scanning for inconsistencies. There were none on the surface, but an instinct told him there was more to the story. A few hours later, a park ranger stumbled upon something troubling. Along a trail near the villa, blood was found smeared on a jagged rock. Nearby, a single sandal was discovered, partially buried in the sand. Its bright orange strap matched the dress Saraphina had worn the evening before. The finding sent a ripple of urgency through the search team, who began to comb the area with heightened focus. The evidence hinted at a struggle, but left more questions than answers. If Saraphina had fallen, where was she now? If she had been injured, why hadn't she returned to the villa or sought help? As officers expanded the search and began interviewing nearby residents, details from the previous night started to emerge. Beatrice, the neighbor who had seen them earlier, shared what she remembered. She described hearing raised voices and what sounded like a heated exchange coming from the villa late at night. While she hadn't thought much of it at the time, it now seemed significant. The words, "You can't control me," stood out in her memory, shouted by Saraphina in a tone laced with frustration and defiance. Declan's composure became increasingly unsettling as the investigation progressed. While he continued to insist that Saraphina had gone for a jog and must have gotten lost or injured, inconsistencies began to appear in his account. The scratches on his arms, which he attributed to a run-in with bushes during his search for his wife, did not match the pristine condition of the trail he claimed to have walked. His explanations for the faint bloodstains near the villa's deck and on the jagged rock along the trail grew vaguer under questioning. By nightfall, the search intensified. A police dog picked up a faint scent leading to a secluded cove just over a mile from the villa. The cove, shielded by dense vegetation and jagged rocks, was only accessible by foot or small boat. It was there, beneath the gently lapping waves, that divers found a set of keys tangled in seaweed. The initials SH engraved on the key ring confirmed they belonged to Saraphina. The discovery deepened the mystery. What had begun as a romantic honeymoon now took a sinister turn. As the sun set on the island, its orange hues casting long shadows over the water, Detective Morris knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary disappearance. Detective Caleb Morris stood on the deck of Azure Cove, the salty breeze brushing against his face as he processed the mounting evidence. The details of the case thus far created a fractured picture, pieces that didn't yet fit together. A single sandal partially buried in the sand, a blood stain on a rock along the trail, and a set of keys retrieved from the water hinted at something sinister. What unsettled him most, however, was Declan Whitmore's demeanor. Calm, almost calculated, it was the composure of a man who seemed prepared for every question. Inside the villa, Declan remained seated on the pristine, cream-colored sofa. His posture was controlled, his movements deliberate, as though he was acutely aware of being watched. His answers to the investigators' questions had been precise, yet they lacked the raw emotion Morris had come to expect from loved ones in cases like this. Declan's calmness, his neatness, and his air of control gnawed at Morris's instincts, suggesting that there was far more to this story than what met the eye. The villa itself mirrored Declan's meticulous nature. Saraphina's suitcase sat neatly by the bedroom closet, half unpacked, its contents arranged with care. Inside a side pocket of the suitcase, Morris discovered a journal. Its pages were filled with sketches of landscapes, lush trees, calm waves, and the villa itself, as well as flowing handwritten notes. On the final page, dated the night before her disappearance, Saraphina had written a cryptic line. "I thought I could fix things. Maybe I was wrong." The words lingered in Morris's mind, their meaning shrouded in ambiguity. Had she been referring to her marriage? Had she sensed danger? Outside, the search team intensified their efforts. Officers methodically combed through the trails surrounding the villa, while divers expanded their search of the cove. Every moment that passed decreased the likelihood of finding Saraphina alive, a grim reality that hung heavily over the team. Morris, however, remained convinced that the answers were closer than they realized. Back at the station, the investigation into the couple's backgrounds yielded intriguing revelations. Saraphina Harper, a Charleston-based artist and gallery owner, was well regarded in her community. Friends described her as fiercely independent and passionate, yet deeply private. Her art, celebrated for its raw emotional depth, often reflected her connection to nature, which made the choice of Amelia Island for her honeymoon unsurprising. Beneath this polished exterior, however, lay hints of strain. A conversation with her sister, Lyra Harper, revealed cracks in the seemingly perfect facade of her new marriage. Lyra described a conversation with Saraphina just weeks before the wedding. Saraphina had expressed doubts about Declan, mentioning that his behavior could be intense and at times controlling. While she had assured Lyra that Declan had never hurt her, the hesitance in her voice had been palpable. Lyra's regret for not pushing her sister harder weighed heavily as she recounted the details. Saraphina's doubts, once brushed aside, now took on a foreboding significance. Declan's history, too, raised red flags. A former military contractor turned survival coach, his professional record was impressive, yet hints of troubling behavior surfaced in personal accounts. A former colleague described Declan as obsessively focused, with a need for control that bordered on unhealthy. Digging deeper, Morris uncovered a series of failed relationships, all marked by tension and abrupt endings. Declan's ability to reinvent himself as a charismatic instructor belied a darker, more volatile past. Meanwhile, the forensic team's work at the villa began to yield results. The bloodstain found on the rock near the trail was confirmed to be human, though it would take time to determine if it matched Saraphina's DNA. A flashlight retrieved from a storage closet in the villa became another piece of the puzzle. While it appeared clean on the surface, luminol testing revealed faint traces of blood near the handle and base. The discovery heightened the urgency of the investigation as the evidence increasingly pointed toward foul play. As the day wore on, another lead emerged. Beatrice Moore, the elderly neighbor who had initially mentioned hearing an argument, came forward with new information. She hesitated at first, but eventually admitted to seeing Declan leave the villa around midnight, the night Saraphina disappeared. Beatrice described him carrying what appeared to be a bag as he walked toward the dock. When he returned, he looked wet, as though he had been in the water. The timing of his movements contradicted Declan's earlier account, raising further questions about his version of events. Acting on this information, the search team focused their efforts on the dock and the surrounding waters. The cove near Azure Cove Villa, known for its strong currents and rocky outcrops, became the center of their attention. As the sun dipped below the horizon, floodlights illuminated the dark waters, casting long shadows across the search area. Divers worked tirelessly, probing the depths for any trace of Saraphina. By nightfall, the search yielded no new evidence, but the growing inconsistencies in Declan's story kept the investigators determined. The villa, once a sanctuary of romance and tranquility, had become a crucible of secrets. Morris stood on the shoreline, staring out into the darkness. The answers, he felt certain, were just within reach. And as the case deepened, the lines between love and control, devotion and danger, began to blur in ways that would soon expose the truth. The villa, once a picture of serenity, now carried an air of unease. The carefully arranged furniture and polished floors seemed at odds with the growing weight of suspicion. Outside, the relentless search continued, officers moving through dense foliage and combing the waters near the cove. The sense of urgency had intensified, as though every second brought them closer to unearthing something unspeakable. Declan Whitmore's behavior became the focal point of Detective Caleb Morris's growing unease. Despite being a man whose wife was now missing for more than 24 hours, Declan showed little sign of genuine grief or desperation. His actions were measured, his words calculated. He volunteered no information beyond what was directly asked, yet his compliance felt like a thin veil for something darker. Forensic results began trickling in, adding more complexity to the case. The blood on the flashlight retrieved from the villa matched Saraphina Harper's DNA. This discovery tied the villa itself to whatever violence had occurred, but it didn't yet explain the full scope of what had happened. The trail of evidence felt like breadcrumbs, leading somewhere ominous yet incomplete. It was the search team at the dock who provided the next critical piece of the puzzle. Acting on Beatrice Moore's testimony, divers expanded their search to the deeper parts of the cove. Hidden beneath a jagged outcrop, partially buried under shifting sands, they recovered a duffel bag. Inside were items that struck Detective Morris like a blow. A torn piece of fabric from Saraphina's orange dress, strands of hair tangled in a knot, and a heavy rock still stained with blood. It was a chilling cache of items that could only have been hidden deliberately. With this discovery, Declan's already fragile alibi began to collapse. He had claimed Saraphina left the villa that morning, but the presence of her personal belongings in the duffel bag, combined with the flashlight and the blood on the rock, painted a picture of premeditation. Yet Declan remained composed when confronted with these findings, his responses calm and clinical. He admitted nothing but offered vague, evasive answers. His insistence that he had nothing to hide was becoming harder to believe. Morris delved deeper into the couple's history, looking for clues that might explain how a honeymoon turned into a nightmare. Saraphina's journal, with its enigmatic entries, revealed flashes of doubt about her relationship with Declan. There were references to his temper, veiled concerns about his possessiveness, and a recurring theme of feeling trapped. These were not the words of a woman secure in her marriage. Interviews with Saraphina's close friends and family deepened the narrative. Several admitted they had been uneasy about Declan from the beginning. His charm, while undeniable, often felt forced, as though he were playing a role. Saraphina's sister Lyra revealed that Saraphina had hesitated before accepting Declan's proposal, confessing doubts about whether she truly knew the man she was about to marry. These doubts now felt hauntingly prophetic. Meanwhile, Declan's past began to yield troubling details. His time as a survival coach was dotted with glowing testimonials from clients, but also whispers of controlling behavior and a need to dominate. Former colleagues described him as intense, prone to bouts of paranoia, and meticulous to the point of obsession. Digging deeper, Morris uncovered a report from Declan's time in the military. The file was heavily redacted, but one incident stood out: a violent altercation with a fellow officer, resulting in an investigation and Declan's eventual resignation. It seemed Declan had been walking a tightrope between order and chaos for years. As these revelations unfolded, another twist came to light. Financial records showed that just days before the wedding, Declan had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Saraphina. The timing was suspicious enough, but it was the beneficiary that truly raised eyebrows. The policy named not only Declan, but also a third party, Madison Clark, his business assistant. Madison had not been a part of the investigation until this point, but her sudden emergence as a potential link to Declan's motive shifted the focus dramatically. Madison, when questioned, appeared visibly shaken. She denied any involvement in Saraphina's disappearance, claiming she knew little about Declan's personal life beyond their professional relationship. Yet her nervous demeanor suggested otherwise. Investigators uncovered a series of text messages between Madison and Declan in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Their tone was cryptic but suggestive, with phrases like, "Once this is over, we'll finally be free, and no more obstacles." The discovery of the duffel bag, combined with the financial motive and the unsettling connection to Madison, placed Declan squarely in the crosshairs of the investigation. His once flimsy alibi was now thoroughly dismantled, yet he refused to break under questioning. Declan remained steadfast in his claim that he had no idea what had happened to Saraphina, insisting he was being framed. The tension reached a fever pitch when forensic analysts confirmed that the blood on the rock matched not only Saraphina's DNA, but also Declan's fingerprints. It was the final, damning piece of evidence that tied him directly to the violence that had taken place. As the evidence mounted, the villa, with its pristine facade, seemed to morph into a house of horrors. Its walls no longer whispered of romance, but of something far darker, a story of control, betrayal, and unspeakable violence. Declan's calm veneer began to show cracks as Morris and his team prepared to make an arrest. The once confident man now seemed restless, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating an escape. The search for Saraphina had turned into a quest for justice, and the weight of the truth felt almost unbearable. As the evening descended once more upon Amelia Island, the winds carried a chill that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the investigation. The case had shifted from a search for a missing bride to something far more sinister, a confrontation with the darkness lurking beneath a carefully curated image of love and devotion. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth that they revealed was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The evidence was mounting, and the weight of the investigation was beginning to press hard on Declan Whitmore. The discovery of the duffel bag, the financial motives tied to the life insurance policy, and the damning fingerprints on the blood-stained rock left little room for doubt. Declan's calm, composed facade, which had thus far insulated him from outright suspicion, was starting to crack. Detective Caleb Morris and his team intensified their focus, determined to turn suspicion into irrefutable proof. They reconstructed Declan's movements the night of Saraphina's disappearance, using witness statements, forensic evidence, and surveillance footage from nearby businesses. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his carefully constructed timeline, exposing gaps that he struggled to explain. The first major inconsistency came from GPS data retrieved from Declan's phone. While he claimed to have been asleep in the villa for most of the night, his phone pinged from multiple locations outside the property between midnight and 3 a.m. The data revealed a pattern. Declan had traveled from the villa to the dock several times, lingering at a specific cove where the duffel bag had been recovered. His insistence that he had only left the villa to search for Saraphina in the morning no longer held up. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the duffel bag provided yet another chilling clue. In addition to the bloodied fabric and strands of hair, investigators found traces of concrete residue on the inside of the bag. This discovery pointed to a disturbing possibility that Saraphina's body had been weighted down before being submerged. The implications of such an act shattered any notion of an accidental death. This was deliberate. This was murder. Detective Morris's next move was to bring Declan in for another round of questioning. Declan arrived at the station dressed impeccably, as though maintaining an air of control could somehow keep the walls from closing in. He repeated his story, sticking rigidly to the same details, despite the mounting contradictions. The tone of the interrogation shifted as Morris presented the findings. The GPS data, the forensic results, and Beatrice Moore's testimony about Declan's midnight trips to the dock were laid out systematically. Declan's confident demeanor wavered as the evidence was piled in front of him. He crossed his arms tightly, his jaw clenched, but still refused to admit to any wrongdoing. His responses grew shorter, more defensive, and less cohesive, a far cry from the polished answers he had provided earlier. Declan's unraveling was amplified when the subject of Madison Clark was introduced. Confronted with the cryptic messages they had exchanged, Declan's composure visibly faltered. Investigators had found additional correspondence between the two, including emails discussing a fresh start and veiled mentions of financial struggles. Madison had maintained her innocence during her initial questioning, but her connection to Declan was undeniable. Morris made it clear that Madison could no longer be considered a passive participant. Declan's refusal to implicate Madison was telling. The calculated way he avoided mentioning her, coupled with the evidence of their correspondence, suggested a deeper involvement. It also hinted at Declan's desperation to keep her out of the investigation, even as his own alibi disintegrated. As Morris pushed harder, Declan's responses turned erratic. He accused the investigators of fabricating evidence, of targeting him because of his military background, of being too blind to consider other suspects. But his protests only further exposed the cracks in his story. Declan wasn't just evading questions, he was cornered, and the truth was closing in. The breaking point came when Morris presented the recovered life insurance policy. Declan's eyes widened, and for the first time he was silent. The policy, with its suspicious timing and the inclusion of Madison as a beneficiary, left no room for ambiguity. It was a financial noose tightening around Declan's neck, and his silence spoke volumes. Outside the interrogation room, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover more about Madison's role. A deeper dive into her financial records revealed significant deposits in her account shortly before the wedding. Money that investigators suspected had come from Declan. The transactions raised new questions about the extent of Madison's involvement. Was she merely a bystander, or had she been an accomplice from the start? As the day drew to a close, Morris and his team prepared to take the next step. With the overwhelming evidence against him, Declan was formally placed under arrest for the murder of Saraphina Harper. His expression remained unreadable as the cuffs were placed around his wrists, but his silence carried a weight that no amount of denial could lift. The arrest was a milestone, but the case was far from over. Saraphina's body had yet to be recovered, and Madison's connection to the crime remained murky. Declan's crumbling alibi had given them a roadmap, but the final answers were still buried, perhaps literally, beneath layers of deception. As Morris watched Declan being led away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth, as horrifying as it already seemed, had not yet fully emerged. The villa, the cove, and the carefully curated lies of Declan Whitmore still held secrets waiting to be unearthed. The discovery of the duffel bag had set the tone for what was to come, a grim unraveling of secrets buried beneath the tranquil facade of Amelia Island. Detective Caleb Morris stood by the water's edge at the cove, watching as divers prepared for what felt like their most critical search yet. The weight of expectation hung over the team, knowing that they were no longer searching for a missing person, but for the final, undeniable piece of evidence: Saraphina Harper's body. The cove, with its jagged rocks and swirling currents, had already revealed fragments of the crime. Now it felt like a living accomplice, holding on to its secrets as the divers plunged into its dark depths. Hours passed as the team meticulously combed the seabed. Every inch was scrutinized under the weak beam of underwater lights, which cast eerie shadows on the silt-stirred bottom. It was late in the afternoon when a diver surfaced, raising his hand in an urgent signal. His voice, muffled by his mask, carried the weight of grim discovery. A weighted tarp had been located, its edges snagged on an outcrop of rocks. The tension among the team was palpable as the tarp was carefully retrieved, its contents revealing a horrifying truth. The remains of Saraphina Harper were inside, bound and weighted with rocks, a deliberate act to ensure she would never be found. The recovery of Saraphina's body brought a wave of emotion. For the search team, it was a moment of grim vindication. For Detective Morris, it was confirmation of his suspicions. But it also deepened the tragedy, revealing the cruelty and precision with which Declan Whitmore had carried out his plan. Forensic examiners quickly took over, meticulously documenting every detail of the discovery. The state of Saraphina's body told a harrowing story. Her arms and wrists bore bruises consistent with restraint, and her neck showed evidence of ligature marks. The blunt force trauma to her head matched the bloodied rock recovered earlier, cementing the timeline of events. The concrete residue found on her bindings mirrored the residue inside the duffel bag, creating a seamless connection between the evidence and the crime. As the team worked through the evidence, the narrative of Saraphina's final moments became clearer. The argument overheard by Beatrice Moore that night was no isolated incident. It was the culmination of growing tension between Saraphina and Declan. He had subdued her with force, using the flashlight as a weapon before binding her and preparing the duffel bag to transport her body. The sequence of actions was as cold as it was calculated, leaving no doubt that this was a premeditated murder. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team, but there was no time to dwell on the horror. Detective Morris immediately pivoted his focus back to Declan, who had maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The timing of the body's recovery was crucial. Morris wanted to confront Declan before he could craft another layer of lies. Inside the interrogation room, Declan's demeanor had changed. While he had been composed during previous questioning, his confidence now bordered on hostility. The mask of calm was cracking, replaced by flashes of anger and defensiveness. Morris wasted no time laying out the findings. The duffel bag, the bloodied rock, and now Saraphina's body formed an unbroken chain of evidence tying Declan to the crime. Declan's response, however, was to double down on his claims of innocence. He insisted that someone was framing him, that the evidence had been planted. His tone grew increasingly erratic as Morris pressed harder, presenting the forensic results and the GPS data that placed Declan at the Cove during the hours when Saraphina disappeared. The life insurance policy, the money trail to Madison Clark, and the damning text messages further dismantled his story. Yet Declan refused to admit guilt, lashing out instead with accusations of bias and misconduct by the investigators. As Declan's resistance faltered, the spotlight shifted to Madison Clark. The financial records linking her to Declan were impossible to ignore, as were the cryptic messages discussing a fresh start and the elimination of obstacles. When confronted with this evidence, Madison's initial denials began to unravel. Her nervous demeanor gave way to panicked explanations, claiming she had no knowledge of Saraphina's death and had only been helping Declan with his financial troubles. However, a deeper review of Madison's correspondence revealed more than just complicity. It suggested foreknowledge. In one message sent 2 weeks before the wedding, Madison had written, "Once it's done, we'll finally be free." Another sent the day after Saraphina's disappearance read, "I can't believe this is actually happening. I'm scared, Declan. What if they find out?" The implication was clear. Madison had been involved, at least to some degree, in the planning and execution of the crime. Whether her role was passive or active, her connection to Declan could no longer be ignored. The tension in the case reached its peak as Morris prepared to formally charge Declan with first-degree murder. The addition of conspiracy charges for Madison was also on the table, though her level of involvement was still under investigation. The weight of the truth hung heavy over everyone involved, from the investigators to Saraphina's grieving family. Each new revelation brought the case closer to resolution, but also underscored the depth of the betrayal and violence that had occurred. As the sun set on Amelia Island, casting long shadows across the cove where Saraphina had been hidden, Morris reflected on the case. What had started as a search for a missing bride had turned into an unrelenting pursuit of justice for a woman whose life had been stolen in the most brutal way. The villa, once a symbol of love and celebration, now stood as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the brightest facades. The recovery of Saraphina Harper's body marked a turning point in the investigation. The evidence was damning, the connections undeniable, yet Declan Whitmore remained defiant. His refusal to admit guilt, even in the face of overwhelming proof, frustrated investigators and added layers of complexity to an already convoluted case. As the pressure mounted, Detective Caleb Morris knew the next phase of the investigation would test every resource and strategy at their disposal. Declan's arrest had not gone unnoticed by the media. Amelia Island, once a quiet haven for honeymooners and vacationers, became the center of a national media frenzy. News crews descended on the island, broadcasting every development of the case. The story of a murdered bride hidden in the shadows of what should have been a romantic getaway captivated audiences. The press painted Declan as a cold, calculating killer, a portrayal that fueled public outrage and amplified the pressure on the investigation. Inside the interrogation room, Declan sat with his arms crossed, his composure deteriorating under the relentless scrutiny. Forensic evidence had tied him to the scene, the GPS data placed him at the Cove, and the financial motives were too glaring to ignore. Yet Declan remained steadfast in his claims of innocence. shifting blame and accusing investigators of fabricating evidence. His words were defiant, but his eyes betrayed a growing desperation. Detective Morris decided it was time to confront Declan with the most damning piece of evidence yet: the autopsy report. Saraphina's injuries told a story of violent restraint, blunt force trauma, and premeditated concealment. The bindings, the concrete residue, and the bruises on her arms and neck painted a picture of a calculated and brutal crime. Morris presented these findings methodically, forcing Declan to confront the reality of the evidence against him. For the first time, Declan faltered. His confident veneer cracked as he leaned forward, his hands tightening into fists. He tried to counter the evidence with the same rehearsed story, insisting that someone else was responsible, but his tone was hollow, his arguments repetitive. He was no longer convincing, even to himself. While Declan struggled to maintain his facade, the focus on Madison Clark deepened. Investigators uncovered more messages and financial transactions that pointed to her complicity. A particularly chilling exchange between Madison and Declan stood out. 2 weeks before the murder, Declan had written, "Once we get through this, it'll all be worth it. No more obstacles." Madison's reply was equally damning. "I trust you. Just don't let it blow back on me." The discovery of these messages placed Madison squarely in the center of the conspiracy. She was brought in for a second round of questioning, her demeanor vastly different from her initial appearance. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by visible anxiety and hesitation. Confronted with the evidence, Madison's attempts to distance herself from the crime became increasingly unconvincing. Detective Morris pressed hard, presenting Madison with the text messages, the financial records, and the forensic findings that linked her to Declan. Her defenses crumbled as the weight of the evidence became impossible to deny. Madison began to talk, tentatively at first, but soon the floodgates opened. She described her relationship with Declan, admitting that it had started as a professional connection, but had quickly turned personal. Madison claimed she had no direct knowledge of the murder, but admitted to helping Declan hide financial troubles from Saraphina, including facilitating the life insurance policy. What Madison revealed next sent shockwaves through the investigation. She admitted that Declan had spoken about Saraphina as an obstacle weeks before the wedding. He had expressed frustration with her independence and hinted that their relationship was a facade, a means to an end. Madison claimed she had dismissed his comments at the time, believing they were just venting, but now they took on a far darker meaning. Madison's partial confession added another layer to the case, but it also raised questions about her full involvement. Investigators believed she was downplaying her role, protecting herself from the consequences of her actions. While her admissions were critical, they left much unsaid, and Morris suspected she was hiding more than she was revealing. The focus shifted back to Declan as Morris prepared for another round of questioning. Armed with Madison's statements, the detective aimed to corner Declan and force a confession. The room felt charged as Morris laid out the narrative piece by piece, connecting Declan's financial desperation, his volatile relationship with Saraphina, and his reliance on Madison. Each point landed like a blow, chipping away at Declan's resolve. As the pressure mounted, Declan's mask finally shattered. His voice rose in anger, his carefully controlled demeanor giving way to frustration and bitterness. He lashed out at the investigators, at Madison, and even at Saraphina, painting himself as the victim of circumstance. The outburst was revealing, not just for what it said, but for what it didn't. Declan's inability to control his emotions exposed his guilt, and the room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Declan's arrest and the mounting case against Madison set the stage for a dramatic legal battle. The evidence was damning, but the complexity of the case meant that the prosecution needed every detail to ensure justice was served. For Morris and his team, the work was far from over. Declan's unraveling was just the beginning, and the road ahead promised more revelations, more complications, and the final pursuit of the truth. The case against Declan Whitmore was nearing its critical juncture. With Saraphina Harper's body recovered and evidence mounting against both Declan and Madison Clark, Detective Caleb Morris knew the focus had to shift toward tying every loose thread into an unassailable narrative. The prosecution's success would depend on airtight connections, evidence that left no doubt about Declan's premeditated actions and Madison's role in enabling the crime. Declan's outburst during his last interrogation had revealed his breaking point. He had lashed out, blaming everyone but himself, but his anger had also provided crucial insights. His words hinted at his frustration with Saraphina's independence and the financial strain he had tried to hide. For Morris, this was the emotional undercurrent that explained the crime. Declan had viewed Saraphina not as a partner, but as an obstacle, a barrier to his control and his financial survival. The team turned its attention to strengthening the case against Madison. Her partial confession had opened new avenues, but Morris believed she was still withholding critical information. Investigators re-examined the text messages and emails exchanged between her and Declan, piecing together a timeline that suggested a deeper involvement. Madison had not only helped Declan navigate his financial troubles, but had also actively participated in setting the stage for the murder. One message stood out. Sent a week before the wedding, Madison had written, "We've come too far for this to fall apart now. You know what needs to be done." The chilling tone of the message, combined with her financial records showing large deposits from Declan in the months leading up to the crime, painted a damning picture. It was clear Madison had been more than just a passive observer. She had become an accomplice. With this new evidence, Morris decided to confront Madison once more. This time, her nervous facade cracked under the weight of direct accusations. Presented with the incriminating messages, Madison attempted to distance herself from the crime, claiming she hadn't understood what Declan had planned. However, her explanations grew more inconsistent, and when pressed about her financial gains, she faltered. Finally, Madison admitted to helping Declan secure the life insurance policy, knowing full well it was part of a larger plan. She claimed she believed Declan would stage an accident, not commit outright murder. Her statements painted her as a reluctant participant, but Morris wasn't convinced. The timeline of events, combined with her willingness to financially benefit from Saraphina's death, suggested she had been complicit from the start. As Madison's story unraveled, the investigation uncovered another chilling detail. Surveillance footage from a local hardware store showed Declan purchasing concrete blocks and rope just days before the couple left for Amelia Island. The receipt matched the residue found on the duffel bag and the bindings used on Saraphina's body. This evidence provided the final proof of premeditation, solidifying the prosecution's case. With the evidence against Declan and Madison now irrefutable, Morris shifted focus to building the emotional weight of the case. Statements from Saraphina's family and friends were gathered to highlight the impact of her loss. Lyra Harper, Saraphina's sister, became a vocal advocate for her memory, describing Saraphina's vibrant personality and her dreams of expanding her art gallery. The family's grief and anger added a human element to the mountain of evidence, ensuring the jury would understand the full scope of the crime. Declan's trial became a media spectacle, with cameras flashing outside the courthouse as the public clamored for updates. Inside, the prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented the timeline of events, the financial motives, and the forensic evidence that tied Declan to the murder. Madison's role was also scrutinized, with her text messages and financial transactions revealing her complicity. The defense attempted to shift blame entirely onto Madison, portraying her as the mastermind who had manipulated Declan into committing the crime. Declan's legal team painted him as a man overwhelmed by financial pressures and caught in a toxic relationship with Madison. It was a desperate strategy, but it highlighted the fractures in the alliance between Declan and Madison. The courtroom became a stage for their unraveling, as each sought to save themselves by incriminating the other. Madison, faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for reduced charges, she testified against Declan, providing chilling details about his obsession with control and his plans to eliminate Saraphina. Her testimony was the final nail in Declan's coffin, portraying him as a manipulative and calculating individual who had orchestrated every aspect of the crime. The jury deliberated for 2 days before delivering their verdict. Declan was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Madison, though spared the harshest penalties due to her cooperation, received a 20-year sentence for her role in the conspiracy. As the courtroom emptied and the cameras moved on to the next headline, Detective Morris reflected on the case. It had been one of the most challenging of his career, a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and violence. Yet amidst the darkness, there was a glimmer of resolution. Saraphina's family had found justice, though it would never erase the pain of her loss. Amelia Island, with its serene beaches and picturesque villas, would eventually return to its quiet charm. But for those who had been touched by the tragedy, the shadows of what had happened there would linger, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the brightest facades. The verdict brought closure, but the pain of Saraphina Harper's loss lingered. Declan Whitmore was sentenced to life without parole, and Madison Clark received a 20-year sentence for her complicity. While justice was served, the story left a lasting impact on everyone involved. Saraphina's family turned their grief into action by founding the Saraphina Harper Foundation, focused on helping others recognize and escape manipulative relationships. Lyra Harper, Saraphina's sister, spoke openly about her siblings' vibrant life and the warning signs they had missed, urging others to trust their instincts and seek help when relationships feel unsafe. The case highlighted how control, greed, and manipulation can destroy lives, but it also emphasized the strength of love and community in overcoming tragedy. Amelia Island returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the shadows of what happened remained a sobering reminder of the darkness hidden behind seemingly perfect facades. Detective Caleb Morris, reflecting on the case, recognized the deeper lesson. Crimes like this begin with small, overlooked signs. For Saraphina's memory and for others like her, Morris vowed to carry those lessons forward, ensuring no story like hers would ever be silenced again. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.